Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you my very first re-ranking video because R.L. Stine has the worst timing ever, and after I've already wrapped up not one, but two rankings of particular subgenres and even franchises within Goosebumps, we have new Goosebumps content involving two things, and one of them, we'll be covering in this video as of now, is Mummies and Goosebumps. And if you don't remember my former ranking, I put this out about a year and a half ago, I think now, and I covered all 11 possible mummy stories you can find. And full disclaimer, I know there's probably mummies featured in some side quests and side story arcs in some Give Yourself Goosebumps books. I get that, but I'm only covering the books that are outright advertised as mummies, the episode outright advertised as mummies, or even short stories with the same advertisement. So, now that we got the most new installment of the House of Shivers series, Night of the Living Mummy, making this the 12th thing to put into a ranking, I felt like just for this book, I'm going to make a re-ranking video for you all to keep you updated. Now, my list, for the most part, if you watch my former ranking, has not really changed all that much, but I did rearrange two of them. And you'll see that in the video at some point. But off the bat, Goosebumps and Mummies are probably some of the more stronger, I guess, subgenres within the series. There's not an objective bad mummy story out there, even when we're talking episodes. Yes, I said it. And you're probably already thinking about a particular one. I don't think there's one bad mummy story that you can find in Goosebumps. They're all pretty enjoyable for what they are. Some definitely stick out more than others. And if you ask me, there's two types of mummy stories in Goosebumps. You have the types that go to Egypt, and you have the types that don't. And the types that don't usually feel the most different or refreshing, or maybe go that museum route that is a little more fun in my opinion, but you'll see that kind of reflect in my ranking first and foremost. And yeah, just be warned of that. Now, since I have a lot to go over, we might as well get into it. But before I get into my ranking of all 12 things we're going to be talking about in this video, let me know down in the comment section, how would you rank the Goosebumps Mummy short stories, books, episodes, you name it, from worst to best for you? Let me know, okay? So, in dead last, at number 12, like the previous video, we have the not good but not bad Return of the Mummy episode. Yeah, my thoughts have not changed on this, and fair warned, I did not reread or rewatch anything for posterity just because a lot of these are still fresh on my mind from the last time I talked about them. This episode is one of the biggest shoulder shrugs from the original Goosebumps TV show from the 90s that I've ever found. And Return of the Mummy stars Daniel DeSantos playing the main character, Gabe, who is the main character in the Curse of the Mummy's Tomb and Return of the Mummy books from the original 62. And his acting is atrocious, and that's probably one of the most standout things about it that people tend to rag on. But in my opinion, I think the episode is just an outright downgrade on almost every conceivable level to the book. Like, from randomly aging down Sari's character, making her even more annoying than she actually was, which I thought she was a bit better than her Curse of the Mummy's Tomb outing in Return of the Mummy's book. But you kind of just make her back to that Curse of the Mummy's Tomb vibe, which I don't like. The budget does not really reflect all that well to the idea they're going for. Even though they do try valiantly, it is quite noticeable here. And the ADR, yeah, not that good. The narration style from the first season, yeah, not that good. And of course, the titular villain from this particular story, Prince Koru, might as well be a laughable non-threat. Even though he's a bit more threatening, I would say, in the episode compared to how he behaves, I'm not a fan of Prince Koru. So that's why this episode is where it is. Sorry, y'all. If you're a fan of this episode, much power to you. All right. After that, I feel bad for keeping this book here because I've thought long and hard about this one, and honestly, I would probably bump it up maybe point 0.1, point 0.2 nowadays, given that I've read, the most recent Mummy story. There's aspects to this one that I think I was kind of underselling the first time. So I think in my review and my last ranking, I had this at a 3.3 out of 5 stars, which is like an okay score. I think this is kind of bordering that C minus 3.5 range nowadays in my head, if I'm being generous. And that's kind of where I'm at with it. I think it's like a low good, just flat out decent book. And it's The Curse of the Mummy's Tomb. Now, the second half to this book has to be some of the best Goosebumps ever written. The writing in this book, I will say this up front, and I'll always say this about Curse of the Mummy's Tomb, and I'll always die on this hill. This has some of the best writing I have ever seen from R.L. Stine. In terms of his prowess, atmosphere, monologue writing, you name it, it is fantastic. And those are really beautiful qualities to have for this book. However, the first half of this book is some of my most hated things I've ever read in Goosebumps. Gabe, Sorry, Uncle Ben, the characters, the prank stuff, the mean-spiritedness, the whining. It is nauseating. It is absolutely nauseating in that first half. If I can have a time machine and go back in time, I'd go to R.L. Stine as he's writing this book, and I would proofread the first half for him and say, hey, just letting you know, this might ruin what possibly could be the best book you ever write in your career. Do you want to go this direction or not? And I would hopefully get through to him. The first half of this book is atrocious. Even though, like I said, the monologue's good and the atmosphere writing is very detailed and the prowess writing's awesome, it's bad. It's not enjoyable. It's cringy. And yeah, there you go. Add some kinks to work out in the original 62. This is definitely a book that, honestly, if I ever make a top 5 books that should have been perfect or had the most potential to be perfect but just aren't, this would be on there for the first half of it. So there's that. Now, at number 10, I'm going to get a lot of heat for keeping this book where I'm at, but I also had this at a 3.5 out of 5 stars. And look, this is a short story. I rank short stories a bit differently than full books, and I guess I'm more fairer on this than I probably should be. If I ever reread this thing, it possibly could score lower, but I remember when I read it, and every time I think about it, I still kind of chuckle with it. So I have, at number 10, The Mummy with My Face from Triple Header Book 2. Now this one is, I've always said this about this story. This is one of Goosebumps' first attempts at establishing a multiverse, or I guess a universe within Goosebumps, where there's some callbacks to the original pyramid actually featured in Curse of the Mummy's Tomb in here, which I thought was really cool about it. The concept, I think, wins me over more than the execution for this one, sadly, though, where it kind of feels like a long-lost Scooby-Doo episode in terms of how the plot unfolds with the main characters and going the whole dungeon crawling route just to find a Deus Ex Machina villain reveal and pretty much a Scooby-Doo type ending going for it. It's really weird and over the top, but there's also some ambitious things going about it with some POV changes and stuff like that to make it interesting. And I don't know, there's some things about it I can commend, probably more, like I said, more than I should. But yeah, I have it here for a reason. I think I have a fun enough time with it. And would I say this is one of the more underrated short stories from the entire Goosebumps run? I want to go out of my way to say that, but I do think it is underrated and kind of overhated. So there's that one. All right, at number 9, we have the second original 62 book. And I gave this one, I don't know if I said the points for the short story for Mummy with My Face, but I think I gave this like a 3.5 out of 5 stars. This on a full book basis is about a 3.6 out of 5 stars, which is a C minus. It's not that much better than its previous counterpart, but it's Return of the Mummy. I gave this like a 3.6 out of 5 from memory. And here's the thing about this book. This book, by every stretch of the means, is average. And that decent kind of way. I think the writing is a downgrade from Curse of the Mummy's Tomb. I think the prowess writing is also a downgrade. The atmosphere writing is a downgrade. But the plot and the characters are a bit more streamlined. It's less annoying. And Gabe and Sorry are actually more likable in this book. Now, where it ends up kind of gets into that corny nature that mummy stories can fall down, especially when we're dealing with mummy stories in Egypt. And when we get to near the end of the book, we get to see the villain, Prince Koru. And he's one of my least favorite Goosebumps villains ever. I'm sorry, he just does not do it for me. He's not like the villain character Ahmed, who I did not even discuss in Curse of the Mummy's Tomb. Ahmed is a GOAT tier Goosebumps villain, in my opinion. And he makes that second half of the book amazing. And he's part of the reason why, at least. But this book just kind of lacks the punch that Curse of the Mummy's Tomb had. Now, if you take the best aspects of this book and just blend it with Curse of the Mummy's Tomb, you probably have a perfect book on your hands. So take that for what you will, but I have it here kind of reluctantly by default, just because I don't have much else to say other than it's average and it's just really flawed. It's kind of boring at times too, but you know, it's here. Why not? All right, now we're on to number 8, and some people might flame me for putting this higher than the actual book, but this is a Goosebumps Presents TV book, and the only time I include these on the ranking is if they fit the ranking I'm kind of trying to fit it into. And for ranking placements, I usually base it on enjoyment, not the outright score I gave it, because when I give scores to TV books, I'm looking at the accuracy of the adaptation of the episode within the book, because these are, or I guess were made to be supplements for the old TV show. So I have Return of the Mummy's TV book here, and the only reason why I have it higher than the episode and the book itself is because it's definitely the short and sweet version of it. Gabe, you don't have to deal with the horrendous acting from Daniel DeSantos in it. He has a decent monologue to him. The story's more streamlined. Prince Koru is a bit better than the book, but then again, if I had to base it on the enjoyment scale, it just kind of registers as average. So that's really all I have to say about this one. All right, at number 7, we have the most recent Mummy book, and the reason why I'm making this re-ranking. We have Goosebumps House of Shivers, Night of the Living Mummy. Now this one, I think, is definitely one of the more ambitious books from the Mummy's stories that you're going to find in Goosebumps, in terms of how Stein is willing to interject dynamicism, kind of similar to how he tried to insert it with The Mummy with My Face in Triple Header Book 2. There's some really sound positives with this book in terms of like scary scenes involving a kid touching a dead mummy corpse, and it kind of, calling to him and pulling him in, and there's a scene of like body swapping going on that's kind of creepy, and there's an outright death that you see happen on page, which is absolutely metal in this book. But the book just kind of feels like it's constantly building to the climax, right? And while it's entertaining for the most part, there's an aspect to it that kind of implies a mystery of, as you see on the cover, an amulet, right? Who has this amulet? Well, they make it blatantly obvious who this person is pretty much from Jump Street once you learn certain bits of information very early on in the book. So it just comes across like, after you learn this information, you're kind of waiting for the book just to get to the reveal, and you have to go through the unnecessary red herrings and all of that. And I guess if you're a younger, inexperienced reader, you can enjoy that more, but it was not for me. And then I think where the book really does suffer the most, sadly, aside from those issues, is just the rushed final act. It's very bleh. And also the resolution of it, Stein kind of chickens out of going a darker route than that he was trying to go, I feel. But I don't know. Then we get the kind of ending that we've seen in so many other books, and it feels like the book just crashed into a wall and kind of just burned itself to the ground. I don't know what else to say. Like I said, I can admire a lot about it. I do think it's better than the original 62 books by far. I do think it's commendable, but to me, there's just way other better ones and better feeling different ones out there. I think I gave this like a 3.7 out of 5 stars, which is just a flat average, but good kind of flat average. And that's a solid score, and I'm fine leaving it there. So that's why it's here. At number 6, this one has not changed its place either, and this one probably is the least mummy story that you're going to find in Goosebumps, and that is The Mummy Walks from Series 2000. I think I gave this one an above average rating, which was, I think, a 4.2 out of 5 stars, which is a flat B tier. And yeah, this one was very different for a Goosebumps book. I almost feel like Stein wanted to write a completely different book, but Scholastic said, hey man, you can't make a book like this. And if you don't know what this book is about, it's essentially about terrorism and war. And they were like, you need to throw in some monsters in it. And he's like, fine, I'll throw in a mummy monster. Why not? That's what it feels like. But yeah, this book is very, very different and all over the place and just wild and kooky and crazy. There's some thought-provoking scenes involving experimentation and interrogation of a child during wartime, and him kind of believing his parents are abandoning him, and he's going off to this foreign country where all these people are looking for him, and it's very perilous in that thriller kind of way. And it's you wouldn't think that a mummy book would have all of that, but that's honestly the biggest weakness to it. The mummy in the story, there is one, but it literally plays no factor into it until like near the end, where there's like this rumor gem to be associated with a mummy, and they got to find the gem essentially. So it's trying to be like a scavenger hunt book, but not really, as it kind of falls into its own detours and all of that. But and yeah, the ending is way too long, and it adds on confusing lack of context by the end of it, just to kind of ruin it a little bit for me. But nonetheless, I think this book, like I said, is above average. It's a pretty fun read, and it's probably the most unique out of all the mummy stories, so take that for what you will. All right, now we're getting into my top 5, and my top 5 is pretty much solidified at this point. Now, I did rearrange a few spots, as you're going to notice from my previous video. I did 2 rearrangements here. And at number 5, we have, honestly, what could have been one of my all-time favorite Goosebumps books, if this specific Give Yourself Goosebumps book had 2 5 out of 5 arcs. And that is Diary of a Mad Mummy. Now, I'm going to say this up front. The one arc about the kid in the museum, where you play the main character, where you find the mummy bandages, and it kind of takes that haunted mask or werewolf skin approach about an item being worn possessing the wearer. That whole arc had fantastic endings, fantastic gore and body horror, scary moments to it, and it was like genuinely perfect. But once you get to the time travel pyramid stuff in the second arc, it gets very average. Which makes this book sadly kind of balance out to where I put it. I think I gave this like a 4.5 out of 5 stars, which is an A minus. But a 4.5 out of 5 stars, I very rarely hand out, especially these days as I've gotten so deep into Goosebumps. And I still think that this book does hold up. And honestly, if I reread this thing, I might be even more generous just for how much I love that first arc. I don't know. Sometimes entertainment kind of overtakes my mind a little bit when it comes to making ratings. I try to be more balanced when it comes to that, but nonetheless, I think this book is really great. For a GYG book, all you can ask for is having fun, scary moments, and this has to have some of the best collective endings throughout the whole book that I've seen in a Give Yourself Goosebumps book in general. So yeah, really love this one. Now at number 4, this one, I think I gave about a 0.1 score higher at a 4.6 out of 5 stars. And this comes from the Slappy World book series. And it's The Dummy Meets the Mummy. Yes, The Dummy Meets the Mummy. I was not expecting to love this book as much as I did before I read it. But after reading it, I totally understand why this is one of the more popular modern Goosebumps books. This is just bona fide fun. You have a monster fight, reminiscent to stuff like Frankenstein meets the Wolfman or Freddy vs. Jason, but you have Slappy, who has some of the coolest powers I've ever seen him have in these books within this. And you have this mummy, Aragotis, who has to be one of the more violent mummy characters ever in Goosebumps, period. And the whole story about the characters in question in this, horror or haunted horror museum of sorts, collecting this macabre stuff. There's just really fun atmosphere to it, and there's just like this kooky, innocent vibe of like having a sleepover within a museum, but having all this stuff go wrong because Slappy gets introduced to this ancient mummy killer thing, and the climax is bonkers, and it's fantastic all the way up until like the final few chapters. If the final few chapters were a bit better, this book would be one of my all-time favorites from the series. And that's saying a lot. I really do love a lot about this book. So that's why it's here at number 4. All right, now here comes the second change. I did rearrange these this time around for my number 3 and my number 2 slot. So at number 3, we have one of my personal favorite Goosebumps episodes from the original show, and it is the adaptation of Don't Wake Mummy. Sorry about that. Don't Wake Mummy's episode, which is featured on the back here. This episode is just bona fide fun. It takes the concept from its short story predecessor. It does something a bit different with it while keeping it mostly the same. And honestly, I have no real objective negatives with it, minus one big thing about it. In case you don't know anything about the story, it's about this kid named Jeff and his older sister, and in the episode version, I guess her friend, are experiencing this mummy come to life within Jeff and his sister's house because their father, who's an Egyptologist, shipped an entire sarcophagus that's sealed with this magic thing back to his own home, so his wife, who's also an Egyptologist, can kind of observe it. But the kids messing around and pranking each other accidentally open the mummy out of the sarcophagus, and Jeff has to deal with the repercussions of that along with his entire family. The story is just really creepy, and the final act to this has to be one of my favorite climaxes in the original show. It's just super tense and super out there, even for this show's standards, and it feels a bit different than your average Goosebumps story because it actually involves the whole family. It's very similar to something like Welcome to Dead House or maybe One Day at Horrorland in that regard, and I really love it for it. Not as much as the short story, which we have yet to talk about, as you'll see higher than this, but yeah, my only real issue is Jeff. Jeff's not necessarily his acting, but I guess how Jeff acts in the episode version isn't as good as the short story, in my opinion. So take that for what you will. But still, love the crap out of this episode. Now, my new number 2 goes to a modern Goosebumps book, and honestly, y'all, I've thought about this, and this potentially has a running to get a higher score in the future if I ever reread it. But I also gave this the same score as Return of the Mummies episode at a 4.7 out of 5 stars. And I just think I admire this one better just because I just love this. And it's Who's Your Mummy from Horrorland. Now on paper, this book should not work. It's a little too weird, a little too out there. If it was a traditional book, I think going beyond the 100-page constraints, this book had a lot of potential to be ruined. So I'm really thankful that it's 100 pages. But minus like one aspect to the story that I just feel is a bit too weird and not really all that logical, involving hair, let's just say. And maybe some aspects near the end to it as well. This book is just fun incarnate. It's about these two kids, Abby and Peter. They go to visit their estranged uncle who lives out in New England, and he has this estate, and he's an Egyptologist that collects all these Egyptian artifacts and has transformed his house into pretty much like a living relic museum of Egyptian artifacts that kind of has replicated what the inside of a pyramid looks like. But as these kids go along, they notice that their uncle is very strange and possibly wants to harm them, and they go through this perilous adventure trying to get away from this man, and there's push and pulls with that, and they have to interact with something that's possibly hiding within inside the house that is absolutely terrifying. And there's some scenes in here that are just super dark and shock value. I don't want to get into any spoilers, but man, this is some of the most dark depictions of gore and just gross out stuff that I've ever seen in Goosebumps. So metal horns for that Stein. Yeah, I absolutely love a lot about this book. And honestly, maybe at one point, I might be able to forgive some of the negatives and give it a guilty pleasure pass. But until that point, I'm fine having it as my number 2. Because my number 1, I think, is by far my favorite and the least flawed. And if you haven't put 2 and 2 together, my number 1 is Don't Wake Mummy short story, which on a short story basis, I have this as a perfect 5 out of 5 stars. I think this is a masterpiece for a short story in Goosebumps if I've ever seen it. It's easily in my top 10 short stories from the entire Tales to Give You Goosebumps lineup. And like I already touched on in the episode, with the episode counterpart in the number 3 slot, I should say, this story is super fun and it's unorthodox for a mummy story to have a sarcophagus being shipped to your house, accidentally breaking the seal of it, and possibly unleashing the mummy that the whole family has to deal with. Now, the only difference between the short story and the episode is the fact that the dad actually plays a role. He comes home to kind of surprise his family, but kind of stumbles across what's going on with it, with the mummy, let's just say. And of course, there is the aspect of the different ending, which I think is super dark and one of the, I think, best endings in Goosebumps history. It's super thought-provoking, and it's like, wow, I can't believe they actually went this direction. But before it can go too far, it kind of ends, so I understand it for that. But yeah, I think this story just speaks to me on so many levels. It shows me how unorthodox Goosebumps really is at the end of the day, and how this can be escapism, but actually truly terrifying and relatable to a kid, even though it's not really realistic. There's still realism imbuing in the story, and there's some good moral lessons to be had, and some good character dynamics and all that with this. And I just think this is a perfect package mummy story in Goosebumps that I've ever seen. And until I get another 5 out of 5 mummy story, or one pushing it, possibly Who's Your Mummy can one day usurp it if I reread it, I don't know. But as of now, Don't Wake Mummies short story is my absolute favorite mummy story from Goosebumps. So yeah, that's my re-ranking of the mummy stories in Goosebumps. Like I said early on, let me know your ranking of the mummy stories. If you've experienced all these, list them down below. What's your least favorite? What's your favorite? Which one do you think is underrated? Which one do you think is overrated? Which one do you think needs more attention? Which ones haven't you experienced yet? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.